What is up, y'all? Welcome back to the GridironTalkZone podcast. Today is just Nick here to talk about NFL free agency grades for each NFL team after week one of NFL free agency. So, most of the big moves went down this week in NFL free agency, but there is still a lot of players left, a lot of good ones who can sign in the near future. But so far, we're just going through the big chunk of free agency because we're probably almost through free agency now with a lot of the good players off the board. So I'm going to be grading every team's free agency through 1 week. And also, I'd like to say be on the lookout because now that free agency is about over, it's March 18th as I'm recording this podcast. Be ready for draft season because draft season's coming. I'm going to be making some videos on the NFL draft. I'm finishing up watching the quarterbacks right now, so I'm going to have my NFL draft quarterback rankings coming out. So I'm excited for that one. Always love to talk NFL draft. And but without further ado, time to get into my NFL free agency grades for each NFL team through week one of free agency. Starting with the Cincinnati Bengals in the AFC North. So the Bengals going into free agency, we knew they had the starting safeties, free agents, Jesse Bates, Von Bell. Um, they were unable to bring back either of them. And considering that the Bengals had 35 mil in cap space, I really would have liked for them to bring back one of those players. Bates has been so important to this defense for the last few years, as has Von Bell. Um, so it's unfortunate that they let them both walk. They did sign Nick Scott, but he's not a very great replacement for two very good safeties, one being an all pro caliber player in Jesse Bates. So that's unfortunate that they lost Bates and Bell. They also lost Hayden Hurst, starting tight end, but I think he can be replaceable. The move that they made that I kind of like is Orlando Brown. Orlando Brown is a player who I thought was going to get overpaid after the Chiefs paid Jawan Taylor $20 million a year and didn't bring back Orlando Brown. But the Bengals ended up getting Orlando Brown for $16 million a year. It's a 4 year, $72 million contract. So it's actually a solid move because you need to get help on the O line. I don't think Orlando Brown has kind of lived up to the hype. Still been a pretty good tackle, don't get me wrong, but I don't think he's this elite tackle or anything like that. But it's definitely an upgrade from Jonah Williams, who has now requested a trade. So I like that move. But losing the safeties really hurt them for me. I'm going to give him kind of a low grade, a D grade, because you did lose two starting safeties who were so critical to your defense and a starting tight end. Um, I'm going to give the Bengals a D. So moving on to the next team, the Baltimore Ravens. Not really much to talk about here. The Ravens do get a D2 because they lost a starting guard in Ben Powers, solid player there. They released a starting interior defensive lineman in Calais Campbell. Um, but they didn't really add any players. Let's see some players who they could have re-signed. Um, so players they could have re-signed: Marcus Peters, haven't re-signed him yet. Justin Houston, haven't re-signed him yet. Demarcus Robinson, I don't believe they've re-signed him yet, but I'm going to check right now on that one. Demarcus Robinson has not been re-signed, and they let Ben Powers go to the Denver Broncos. So they're going to get a D just because, yes, they didn't lose a lot of players that were key players like the Bengals did, but they did lose a few guys and they haven't added anyone. So I'm going to give the Ravens a D so far. Moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers, I'm going to give a B. So the Steelers, they exchanged some players. They lost cornerback Cameron Sutton. They added Patrick Peterson. Um, so I think that's a slight upgrade. Sutton was a good player, but I think Peterson, with his zone ability, his ability to still get interceptions and be good in zone coverage at his age, I think is going to be a pretty good fit for this defense. Looking at the linebackers, you added Cole Holcomb and Landon Roberts, and then you lost your three key linebackers from last year: Robert Spillane, Miles Jack, and Devin Bush, none of which played very good last year. Um, Holcomb and Roberts are solid players, so I think that they kind of upgraded slightly at linebacker and at cornerback. So I'm going to give them a B. They didn't do nothing major. They just exchanged players, in which I think they did minor upgrades at. So the Steelers will get a B for me. Moving on to my first A of free agency, the Cleveland Browns. So going into free agency, I said the Cleveland Browns needed to get Miles Garrett an edge too. They added Obo Okoronkwo is how I think you say his name from the Texans. Had a career year last year. I think can be a solid addition. But what gets them the A grade is the additions of Dalvin Tomlinson and the interior defensive line. Huge need for this team. Very good, legitimate stud at run stuffing and provides a little bit pass rush too. And you added a starting free safety in Juan Thornhill, who's going to be your John Johnson replacement. So I like that. But mainly the Dalvin Tomlinson move, just an amazing move for this team, is going to get them an A grade. You also added Jordan Akins, who can be David Njoku's backup at tight end. Um, you did lose Jacoby Brissett, but you're starting Deshaun Watson at quarterback now anyway. Greedy Williams, you lost. Solid depth corner, but nothing more than that for them. And you lost defensive lineman Taven O'Brien, but you had Dalvin Tomlinson, so you had a huge upgrade there. So the Browns are going to get an A for me for the first week of free agency so far. I liked what they did, addressed positions of need on the defensive line, and added a legitimate, very good player in Dalvin Tomlinson. Moving on to the AFC South team, starting with the Jacksonville Jaguars, they get a D for me. They didn't really make any additions of note, and they lost the starting left tackle in Jawan Taylor, and they lost Arden Key, who was a solid edge depth player for them last year. So that hurts them. And excuse me, I said they lost the starting left tackle. They actually lost the starting right tackle in Jawan Taylor, because Cam Robinson is the starting left tackle. So yeah, still not ideal to lose a starting tackle in Jawan Taylor. Um, but you did, but you do get Calvin Ridley back from suspension now, but I'm not counting this into the free agency because it wasn't like he was addition in free agency or anything. He was from a trade last year. So just looking at losing Jawan Taylor, Arden Key, you get a D for me. And this is a team that's going to look to contend too, but they spent so much money last offseason that they don't have a ton of cap flexibility this offseason. And you factor that they're going to have to pay some guys coming up soon in the next year or two. So they couldn't really do much. They were in a tough spot here. So for them, I'm hoping that they can just find a left tackle replacement, and hopefully Calvin Ridley becomes a star at receiver again. And then this team is still looking pretty good for next year. But they get a D for me for this free agency period. Tough spot with the cap situation. Um, but moving on to the Tennessee Titans, they will also get a D for me. Lots of D's here early, D grades for free agency. Titans, they have a lot of moves. I'll just name some guys that they added. Andre Dillard, Aziz Al-Shahil, Daniel Brunski, Arden Key, but they also lost and cut a ton of veteran players. Bud Dupree, Robert Woods, Ben Jones, Nate Davis, David Long Jr., and DeMarcus Walker. So because of the key veterans lost, and I think most of those veterans are better players than the ones they added, I'm going to give them a D grade here. Team that's, I don't know if they're in a rebuild or a retool. I think since they're sticking with Tannehill right now, they're kind of in a retool situation. But I think it's going to end up being a rebuild next year because I don't think this retool is really going to get them anywhere in 2023. Moving on to the next team, the Indianapolis Colts. They also get a D grade from me, being because they lost Bobby Okereke, starting linebacker. They traded Stephon Gilmore for, I believe, a 5th-round pick. It's still a pretty good corner. Not really going to factor much about Matt Ryan. Lost Matt Ryan, added Minshew. Matt Ryan wasn't going to be the starter next year anyway. Gardner Minshew probably won't be the starter next year anyway. Not going to make a big deal out of that. And you lost your number 2 receiver from last year, Paris Campbell. I do think Alec Pierce is probably a better player than Campbell going forward. So you'll have Alec Pierce at number 2, but you still lost a pretty good starting receiver. So that hurts you. And you lost a good starting linebacker and corner. So you get a D grade here because you did add Samson Abukum, but that isn't like an amazing move in my opinion. Samson Abukum is a solid player. He's probably going to be an edge 2 now, but you still don't really have that edge 1 because Kwity Paye kind of hasn't developed into that. So I feel like the Colts are kind of in a spot here where they got worse. So you're going to get a bad grade. They get a D grade. because they did get worse on paper. Moving on to the Houston Texans. The Houston Texans, I like some additions they made. They added Robert Woods, Jimmy Ward, Shaq Mason, Noah Brown, Sheldon Rankins. Lots of good players there, or lots of quality players there. And you only lost Obo Okoronkwo and released AJ Cann, I believe, and lost Jordan Akins in free agency to the Browns. I'd like for them to fill that hole at tight end now. They do have Brevin Jordan in the room. They could always re-sign OJ Howard, but Jordan Akins was a pretty solid tight end for them. So that's kind of tough. But other than that, you upgrade at many different positions, important positions too, like receiver, O line, D line, and safety. So I'm going to give the Texans an A here. Fairly close to an A plus, but just losing Jordan Akins hurts a little bit and didn't add enough like that star. They added very good players, but they didn't add that star. So they get an A for me. Very good free agency for the Texans. I love where this franchise is starting to move because it's felt like they've been rebuilding for years and haven't made a ton of progress. But now with some of the moves they made this offseason, I feel like they're making finally a little bit of progress in the rebuild. And also like the coach hire of D'Amico Ryan. So Texans get an A grade for free agency so far. On to the AFC East teams. The Buffalo Bills, this will be short. Buffalo Bills will get a C for me. Reason why it's not worse than that is because they did bring back Jordan Poyer. That was a big deal for me. Resigning Jordan Poyer is huge, but you did lose Tremaine Edmonds, who is pretty much a star player at this point, developing star on your defense. So that hurts you, but you can still keep it at about an average C grade because of the addition or the re-signing of Jordan Poyer. Another quick notable move, they signed Connor McGovern. Potentially can be a starting interior offensive lineman at guard probably. So that's, I guess, somewhat noteworthy. But yeah, re-signed Poyer, but lost a star player in Edmonds. Going to get you about a C average grade. On to the Miami Dolphins. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. The Dolphins had a very good offseason so far. You traded for star cornerback Jalen Ramsey for, I believe, a third-round pick in Hunter Long, a backup tight end with like one catch or something in his career. So you immediately have the best cornerback duo in football with Ramsey and Howard. You upgrade at linebacker, letting Landon Roberts walk away from your team and signing David Long. And you added a depth safety in Deshaun Elliott. He might be the starter potentially if they let Alec Rowe walk in free agency, which could happen. You also have Brandon Jones back there in that room, though. They get an A for me. The only reason why they do not get an A plus is because they did lose Mike Gesicki in free agency to the Patriots. Apparently, they don't view him as a scheme fit, but now you kind of lose a very good pass catching tight end. And you're kind of weak there at that next third threat in your offense after the big two in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So they get an A, not an A plus. But still a very good offseason for the Dolphins. This defense, they turned it from good to arguably the best defense in football, up there with the Niners. They do have Vic Fangio at defense coordinator now, so I'm so excited to watch this defense next year. They're going to be very good. On to the New England Patriots. Patriots made some moves. They replaced Jacoby Myers with Juju Smith-Schuster. I think that's a slight upgrade. I think Juju's a little bit bigger player than Jacoby Myers and can do more work after the catch in the slot than a Jacoby Myers. But that's still not too big of an upgrade, but still an upgrade at an important position. Looks like they're probably going to lose Isaiah Wynn now that they signed Riley Reif. I think this is going to be a downgrade at tackle. But I like that they added Mike Gesicki to the tight end room with Hunter Henry. I expect Gesicki to get at least split the reps, maybe even be the tight end one, because I do think he's a better player than Hunter Henry. And you added depth running back in James Robinson. Players you lost, Devin McCourty to retirement, so I'm not going to really count that against you. And you did release Jalen Mills. So I feel like the Patriots made some solid moves here. They're going to get a B plus for me. Not an A because I wish they would have added that like stud number one receiver. But then again, that wasn't really in free agency. But I wish they would be looking into maybe trading for a D-Hop, a Jerry Jeudy, signing an OBJ, just more explosive, exciting threat at receiver. But they can always draft a guy in the first round, so that can be good. Moving on to the New York Jets. The New York Jets are going to get a B plus for me in free agency. The Jets added Alan Lazard, Chuck Clark. They added a guard, Schweitzer. Um, Lost Mike White, but he's not going to be playing quarterback for them next year. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. You lost Sheldon Rankins, who was a key part to your interior defensive line. I expect them to move John Franklin Myers to the interior and have the former first round pick Jermaine Johnson be the new edge rusher starter. But Sheldon Rankins, that's a tough loss. But I think adding the number one receiver, Adeline Lazard, adding a depth safety in Chuck Clark, and adding some depth into your interior offensive line gets you a B plus for me. The reason why it's not an A yet is because the Aaron Rodgers move has not gone down yet. But Rodgers has made it clear now he wants to play for the New York Jets. I expect a trade come in some point this offseason. Once that trade goes down, this will get the offseason to an A as long as they don't give up like 2 firsts or anything crazy for Rodgers. But yeah, the Rodgers move should be coming down soon. So that's going to be big for the Jets. But I can move on to talk about the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs, coming off a Super Bowl win this offseason, had kind of an average offseason. They get a C for me. They replaced Orlando Brown Jr. with Jawan Taylor. They replaced Frank Clark with Charles Omenihu. They replaced Juan Thornhill with Mike Edwards. They added Drew Tranquil at linebacker. They lost Juju Smith-Schuster, though. They lost Saunders, a depth interior piece. They lost the starting right tackle, Andrew Wiley. And it's looking like they're probably going to lose McCole Hardman unless they sign him back. But yeah, they made some solid replacements, maybe upgrades in a few spots, but they didn't. But they also lost a lot of pieces and didn't make up for those quite yet. So they're going to get about a C average offseason for me so far. Moving on to the Chargers. Chargers, they get a B for me. Because they re-signed a couple key players. Let me look at it real quick. They re-signed Morgan Fox in the interior defensive line, by far the most impactful interior defensive player last year. And they re-signed Trey Pipkins, who will probably be the starting right tackle. They also added Alec Kendricks at linebacker. Good move there. He replaces Drew Tranquil, a slight upgrade in my opinion. But you did lose Nasir Adderley to retirement. Again, it's a retirement, not going to count that against you. But they released guard Matt Filer. I believe his first name is Matt. Let me double check. Yeah, Matt Filer is Matt's his first name, last name Filer. He was a solid guard for the Chargers, so that may be a little bit of a hurt, but they obviously released him to save cap, and maybe they trust Sawyer, Osala, I forget how you say his name, the Georgia guy who they drafted last year. Maybe they trust him to play guard. He played right tackle last year. But yeah, the Chargers, I think the big addition of Kendricks and re-signing some key guys gets them a B grade for me. On to the Las Vegas Raiders. So the Raiders, I don't like the cutting Derek Carr stuff. I do think Jimmy Garoppolo they paid him solid amount. They didn't overpay for him. So I think he can be a solid addition at quarterback. But yeah, you did trade Dalen Waller for a third round pick. Thought that was a bad move. But you did add Jacoby Myers. That's a good pickup. And it was at a reasonable price too. Lost Andrew Billings, a legitimate good run defending player in the interior. Added a solid linebacker. I'm not even going to say solid. A borderline starting caliber linebacker in Robert Spillane. Added a starting caliber safety in Marcus Epps. So added some starting caliber players. Downgrade at quarterback. I think they downgrade at pass catcher. I know they play different positions, tight end, receiver, but downgrade at pass catcher from Dalen Waller to Jacoby Myers. They're going to get a D for agency from me. Downgrade at 2 important positions. Didn't add enough on defense. Haven't re-signed starters on defense that I thought they should have re-signed by now. For example, Rock Yassin. I think they should have resigned by now, or at least add a corner to replace him. They haven't done either. So they're going to get a D offseason for me, for free agency for me so far. Onto the Denver Broncos, who get an A. An A free agency for the Broncos. They added Ben Powers, pretty good guard. Added a solid right tackle in Mike McGlinchey, good run blocker. They made some moves in the interior defensive line, adding Zach Allen and letting Draymond Jones and Williams walk from the team. But the offensive line additions is what gets them an A for me. Big offensive line additions for the Broncos. And I think that Zach Allen is a slight upgrade from Draymond Jones. So they're going to get an A for me. Addressing critical part to your team, offensive line. Like it a lot for the Broncos. On to the NFC teams. Let me take a sip of water before I get into the NFC teams. I realized I've been forgetting to put up a graphic for the bottom part. I was gonna put up like the team and the grade. Um, in fact, let me do that. Let me put up the team and the grade. So, for example, next team is Vikings. Vikings free agency grade for me is going to be a D. So I'll put that up for them right now. The Vikings get a D for me so far. Looking at the Vikings here, they lost Patrick Peterson and they signed Byron Murphy. You get younger at corner, but I think it's a downgrade for the team that's probably trying to win now. Um, Released Eric Kendricks, still don't really understand that. I do not understand releasing Adam Thielen at all. I know he is aging, he's 32, but he's still a very productive slot receiver who you only saved $6 million by releasing. You lost a stud run defender in Dalvin Tomlinson, and you signed Dean Lowry. That's a big downgrade. You did add Marcus Davenport, but he's probably going to be a Zadarius Smith replacement because it sounds like they can't work out a contract with Zadarius Smith, so he might be gone too. So Vikings D offseason for me so far. A team that won 13 games last year but didn't win a playoff game. You expect this team to try to make an improvement, to take a step from just a very good team to a contending team, and they've only downgraded. And part of that is their fault by releasing veteran players who are still productive. So I don't really understand this move. Maybe Alec Kendricks wasn't the best fit for their defense, but they brought in Brian Flores anyways. Brian Flores maybe not think Kendricks is a great fit. I don't know. But yeah, you're still releasing a very good linebacker. So on to the Detroit Lions. I'm gonna update this graphic real quick. The Lions get a B plus. Dan Campbell and company making some moves, adding two pretty quality starting caliber corners in Cameron Sutton and Emmanuel Mosley. Sutton's better than Mosley, but still both good players. You upgrade at running back, going from Jamal Williams, who was just more of a goal line running back, to kind of do it all running back in David Montgomery, but really a power strong back, fights through contact good, pretty elusive, and can provide some receiving ability out of the backfield. You did lose Deshaun Elliott at safety, but he's kind of just was going to be a third safety anyway because you already have Tracy Walker and Kobe Joseph. And you lost starting guard last year, Evan Brown, but he was only a starter because your other guard was injured. I forget how to say his name. HV would just go by. Has a very long last name. But yeah, so the players they lost weren't big losses, and they actually upgraded at running back and upgraded at a desperate, needy position at cornerback. We'll see if they ended up getting Amani O back at corner, but I don't expect him to come back to the team now that they added two starting caliber corners. But yeah, get a B plus. Corner, you can never have enough good corners, and they added two starting caliber players at that position. But they're not an A because they haven't made that like splash star signing that you would like to see them maybe make. But still making moves, improving the team. Get a B plus for me. Moving on to the next team, the Green Bay Packers. Well, the Packers offseason has been a disaster so far. The Packers offseason for me gets an F so far. Not even factoring the Aaron Rodgers thing. You lost Alan Lazard, your number one receiver last year. Yes, Christian Watson can probably be your number one, but then you're looking at Romeo Doubs is your number two. Your number three has barely any NFL experience. You're looking at 3 second-year players maybe being your top 3 receivers. That's not very good. And then you factoring in you lost I think they lost Jerron Reed. Did they lose Jerron Reed? Actually, no. Jerron Reed is still a free agent. They didn't lose him yet. Lost Dean Lowry, who didn't provide. Oh, no. Actually, they did lose Jerron Reed. Jerron Reed did sign with the Seahawks. Had that written down. Didn't have what he signed with. Just had that they lost him. But yeah, they lost Jerron Reed to the Seahawks. Pretty good interior defensive player. Dean Lowry didn't do too much last year, but you still lost Dean Lowry. You lost Robert Tonyan, your starting tight end. They're looking very depleted at pass catchers, and they haven't made any improvements to the roster at all. So they get an F from me. They're probably going to lose Rodgers too. We'll see if that happens, but not even factoring that. It's a bad offseason. You're losing 3 pretty good players and Dean Lowry too, and you didn't add anyone. So Packers get an F for me on the offseason so far. Going to the next team, my Chicago Bears. I am loving what the Bears are doing this offseason. The Bears get an A+ so far. First off, before free agency started, traded. Amazing trade for DJ Moore and some other picks for the number 1 overall pick. But you get DJ Moore, very good receiver, number 1 receiver, top 15 receiver in football. You address linebacker, Tremaine Edmonds, TJ Edwards. Edmonds may be a little bit of an overpay, but for his talent, he has the talent to be the best linebacker in football. He's not that right now, but he is a top 10 guy still, and he has the talent to be the best at the position. He's worth the money, even though they may have overpaid slightly. I think he's the 4th highest paid linebacker. Hey, he could be a top 4 linebacker in football next year. So good signing. TJ Edwards played like a top 10 linebacker in football last year. Was the Eagles' signal caller for Super Bowl defense. Cheap deal, steal of a signing. They added pretty solid guard in Nate Davis. He was one of the Titans' best offensive linemen the last 2-3 years. They added DeMarcus Walker, coming off a career year, 7-sack season for the Titans. Robert Tonyan, depth piece at tight end. Dante Foreman, depth piece at running back. And they added Andrew Billings, who is a legitimate good run defending interior defensive lineman, which they need. This is what teams who are trying to compete do. They go sign players, veteran players, 1-year deals like a Robert Tonyan and a Dante Foreman, who are depth pieces on 1-year deals just to have good players in your room and key depth. Teams that are trying to compete do these things. I'm predicting right now the Bears are going to have a top 10 offense in football next year, led by Justin Fields. Pretty good receiving core now, improving O-line. The only reason why they don't have an A+ for this offseason, they were so close to being my first, and I'll spoil, only A+ for the offseason so far. They get an A because they haven't addressed a position like right tackle. They didn't re-sign Riley Reef, which I agree with, but they haven't added a right tackle yet. I really want them to add Isaiah Wynn. I think that they can get him pretty cheap. He's a pretty solid player at that position. I like how they're standing by Braxton Jones as the left tackle, and they didn't overpay for an Orlando Brown Jr. or Jawan Taylor, because Braxton Jones had a productive rookie year as a left tackle, probably the best rookie tackle, and he was a mid to late round pick. So that is a steal of a draft pick as long as he continues to play well. It did hurt to lose David Montgomery, especially because he went to the Lions for pretty cheap. But you replaced him with Dante Foreman. But yeah, not adding an offensive tackle on the right side or an edge rusher yet. I'd like to see them maybe resign or bring back Leonard Floyd, who used to play for them, spent his last few years with the Rams. I would like to see them bring him back to the Bears. That would be a good move, but just not addressing the 2 very important positions in right tackle and edge rusher is what brings them down to just an A, but still improve the team drastically. And this is a team who can compete for the playoffs next year. With the young roster they have, the improved players, they still have draft picks. This is an improved football team. So I like what the Bears are doing. My Chicago Bears, I love what they're doing so far. So we can move on to talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So the Buccaneers, I'm not going to factor in the Tom Brady retirement because, again, it's a retirement. They can't control that. And he was old anyway. They expected him to retire probably. Um, but the Bucks get a D off season for me so far. Um, Adding Baker Mayfield, I like that move because it's a solid, um, can compete with Kyle Trask, probably beat out Kyle Trask, I would expect from Baker. But it's a solid move to bring in a guy who maybe you can get something out of him. If not, you can draft a quarterback next year, or even still draft one this year in the first or second round. I don't even know if they have a first actually, but if they do, they could still draft one, or they could draft a quarterback in the second round or something. But um, yeah, the reason why they get a D is because left tackle released Donovan Smith. You don't have a left tackle on your roster. Josh Wells is a free agent. You didn't bring him back yet to your team as of like yesterday. Let me double check and make sure they didn't re-sign him. But Josh Wells has not been re-signed by the Bucks. So they still need a left tackle. Funny enough, the depth chart actually has Tristan Woods playing right and left tackle, which is obviously not possible, but it just shows that they need to sign a left tackle. But as far as looking at other moves, they traded guard Jack Mason for a late round pick swap. Don't understand that move. Mike Edwards, they lost, who was a starting safety for them last year. Um, Replaced Leonard Fournette with Chase Edmonds. I think that's a downgrade. So this roster is just getting worse, and they're going to have a D grade because of that. So moving on to the next team, the Carolina Panthers. This team's very interesting for me. Um, I'm going to give the Panthers a B plus grade, and I'll explain why. The Panthers, we all know they made the trade for the first overall pick. Obviously, they're going to take a quarterback. I'll get into who I think they should take whenever I do my draft quarterback rankings here pretty soon. That'll be in video format, by the way, with some nice graphics too. So be on the lookout for that pretty soon. But they added some pieces. Von Bell, starting good safety in Von Bell. A pretty good starting caliber tight end in Hayden Hurst. Pro Bowl caliber running back in Miles Sanders. They added Williams on the defensive line. Solid move there. He's going to replace likely Matt Ioannidis. They also added Shai Tuttle, who could be the starter there, instead of Matt Ioannidis, who they do not have on their roster anymore. But reason why they get a B plus and not an A, because they did improve in multiple spots of the football team. But the big part is the DJ Moore trade. You lost your number one receiver, and they've done nothing to replace him outside of sign a tight end. So you need to go get some receivers, and draft the right quarterback at one, and you'll have an A off season. But right now it's a B plus because they have upgraded the team. But you really need to go get a receiver, probably in the second round this year because you're kind of short on picks. I would still like to go see them sign maybe a DJ Chark to be kind of that number two, to hopefully a number two or a 2A, 2B kind of scenario with the second round pick. Hopefully drafting a receiver who can either be your number one, kind of be a 2A, 2B kind of player to DJ Chark. But yeah, moving on from the Panthers, they do get a B plus offseason still, so pretty good offseason so far as they are improving the team. Looking at the next team, the New Orleans Saints have a D, not a D. What are the Saints? They have a C grade for me. I give the New Orleans Saints a C grade for the offseason so far. They upgrade a quarterback from Andy Dalton to Derek Carr. But outside of that, they didn't re-sign really any key free agents that I thought that they should have re-signed. They didn't re-sign David Onyemata. He went to the Falcons. Caden Elis went to the Falcons too. Pretty good hybrid linebacker for them last year. They lost Shai Tuttle, Marcus Davenport. They lost a lot of good defensive players, and the replacements were Saunders and Shepard. Not amazing replacements in the interior defensive line for Onyemata and Shai Tuttle. They did add a depth running back piece in the Jamal Williams, but outside of that, this team regressed. Yes, Derek Carr is a better quarterback than Jimmy G. John. But yeah, this team regressed roster-wise, especially defensively. As much as I like the Derek Carr move, they do get a C off season for me. That's what's kind of holding them from being a D off season. But yeah, we can move on to the Atlanta Falcons, who have had a good offseason so far. Falcons have had a good offseason. They're gonna get an A for me. Um, the key signing was Jesse Bates. Jesse Bates. They actually got him at a reasonable price. Um, and outside of Jesse Bates, David Onyemata, I just mentioned, they brought in to pair up with Grady Jarrett in the interior defensive line. Traded for a good pass catching, not an amazing pass catching tight end. I'll say an athletic tight end in Jonnu Smith, who didn't work out in New England, but Arthur Smith has experience with him from the Tennessee days, so that can be good. Caden Ellis was a good hybrid linebacker for the Saints last year. They bring him over to Atlanta, and outside of releasing Marcus Mariota, um, well, they actually added Taylor Heineke to kind of be the competition with Desmond Riddle, which I think is a slight upgrade from Mariota. But outside Mariota, they only really lost Isaiah Oliver, who was just kind of a depth corner. So you factor in the star player they added, Bates, the very good player on Yamada, the other solid pieces. They get an A offseason for me. This team's improving. The reason why they don't get an A plus is because they haven't addressed receiver outside of Drake London. They really need to get a number 2 and number 3 receiver. So I'd like to see them do that. But yeah, still a pretty good offseason. Moving on though to the Philadelphia Eagles, they made a lot of moves. I'll just give the grade first. The Eagles are going to get a D offseason for me. I was between a C and D here. C kind of being an average offseason, D a little bit below average. They get a D because they were in a tough situation. They just made the Super Bowl, had tons of free agents. Um, the guys who they did bring back, I like. They brought back Fletcher Cox, James Bradbury, Jason Kelsey. Um, there was talks that Darius Slay might have been gone, but they ended up keeping him, so that was nice. But they have yet to sign C.J. Gardner-Johnson back. They lost T.J. Edwards. The big loss was Javon Hargrave in the interior defensive line. Fairly key player to that defense, so you would have loved to see them bring him back. They also lost Khalil White and Miles Sanders. So just they lost so many starters. They lost basically more than they retained, and they lost their best free agent in Javon Hargrave. That's kind of what gets them the D grade. They added a depth corner in Greedy Williams and solid running back in Rashad Penny, but that's still a downgrade for Miles Sanders. And they just lost too many key players to get a C grade. So they're going to get a below average D grade for me. But yeah, moving on to the next team, the Dallas Cowboys, who I actually thought had a pretty solid offseason so far. I'm going to give the Cowboys a B. Um, they didn't lose too many key players. They lost Connor McGovern, quality starting interior player, and they lost Noah Brown. They released Ezekiel Elliott because of the contract situation and because he's been declining. But the big move that gets him a B is the trade for Stephon Gilmore. Stephon Gilmore for a fifth round pick is a steal. Pairing with Trevon Diggs, now you have one of the top cornerback duos in the league, and that's very important for a passing league to be able to defend the pass. And that move alone gets them a B because the losses they lost were minor. So adding a very good player still late in his career, Stephon Gilmore, gets the Cowboys a B grade for me. On to the New York Giants, the G-Men. They made quite a few moves this offseason. They addressed some positions of need, so that's going to get them a B plus for me. They added starting linebacker Bobby Okereke from the Colts. You traded for Darren Waller for only a third round pick. So that was a very good value trade. And they signed Paris Campbell, who had his best season of his career last year. He was finally healthy, and he put together a pretty good season on a dysfunctional team. The reason why they don't get an A is because they did lose Julian Love, who was a pretty good player in the secondary for them. He can play some corner, safety, kind of a piece who you can move around in the defense. So that was a tough loss. But the main reason why they don't get an A is because Paris Campbell is a good player. I wish they found a way to get that number one receiver via trade. There's some guys out there like Jerry Jeudy, DeAndre Hopkins. They didn't quite get that number one receiver for Daniel Jones, but Dalen Waller can be a very good tight end. Campbell, good addition to the receiver room. So all in all, pretty good offseason, get a B plus. On to the not the Eagles, the Washington Commandos. The Commandos for me, they had about an average offseason, get a C. Going into the offseason, I was saying the Commandos didn't really have too many holes on the roster. They were just a few big moves away from having a very complete roster that can compete for the playoffs, as long as Sam Howell turns out to be pretty good, which I'm a big Sam Howell fan. Um, but they didn't make any really big moves. They kind of just exchanged players. They lost linebacker Cole Holcomb, and they signed Cody Barton, formerly of the Seahawks. Not really an upgrade. They released Carson Wentz, who was going to be the QB2 next year if he was on the roster anyway, but you save so much money doing that, so that was a good move. Bring in Jacoby Brissett. I love this move because Brissett played some pretty good ball as the starter for the Browns for the majority of last season. And he's going to kind of be in that room to mentor Sam Howell. If he needs to step in and play, you have a quarterback who can play. And put some pretty average play out there too. And at moments last year, he was looking pretty good too. So that's a nice move. But you added I don't understand these additions to the O line. Nick Gates, he was formerly on the Giants. He's a starting caliber interior player, can play some guard and center, but he's not a special player. So I think they should have went for a better free agent signing there. Andrew Wiley, um, I only see this move because Eric Bieniemy is now the new OC. He was with Wiley in Kansas City. Wiley was never an amazing right tackle for the Chiefs. He had a solid Super Bowl, but outside of that, he's just kind of a starting caliber right tackle. Nothing special. Can give you average play at times, but I feel like they should have went for more upgrades on the O line instead of just settling for solid players who starting caliber but nothing special. So I don't think that they went and made enough big time moves or added any star pieces to the team or even pretty good players to make this team take a big step. So they also released safety Bobby McCain, but they have some in-house guys like Derek Forrest and Cameron Curl to play that spot already. So yeah, I'm gonna move on to the next team, down to the last division to talk about now, the NFC West teams. Starting with the 49ers, and this might seem a little surprising with this grade, knowing they did have a big addition, but I'm going to give them a D. The Niners, they had a D offseason for me. The reason being is because they didn't bring back enough of those free agents. Going into free agency, Mike McGlinchey, starting right tackle, they didn't bring him back. Starting safety, Jimmy Ward, they didn't bring him back. I'm not going to give him too much on that one, though, because they still do have Ufanga back there. And Jimmy Ward, he wasn't as much of an impact last year as he has been in past years for this team on the defensive side of the ball. But still, a starting caliber player you lost. Emmanuel Mosley, a starting caliber corner you lost. Aziz Al-Shahir, another player, he was a third linebacker. You have Dre Greenlaw, Fred Warner. Not going to give him too much pain for, or not gonna be down on them too much for that one. But you lost another starting player, offensive guard Daniel Brunski. You lost your edge number 2 and edge number 3 from last year in Charles Amenahu and Samson Abukum. So you lost a lot of either key depth players or actual starters on your team last year. So for that reason, they get a D. That being said, the reason why they don't get an F, they get a D, is because they made a splash signing. Javon Hargrave just really helps this defensive line take a big boost from elite to more elite than it already is. So this is a very good move. Isaiah Oliver is going to be the Emmanuel Mosley replacement, solid replacement. They also did add Sam Darnold, who's going to kind of just be in that quarterback room now. Could see him play, depending on how Brock Purdy and Trey Lance's injuries they come back from. How they come back from injury could depend if Sam Darnold has to play or not. But he's kind of the Jimmy Garoppolo replacement. They did lose Jimmy G, but they get a cheap alternative in Sam Darnold. So I think that's a sneaky good signing because if he has to play, you have a talented quarterback who kind of hasn't worked out in the NFL, but actually put together a good string of play for the last 6 or so games of last season. He played the best ball of his career when he was inserted into the lineup after Baker Mayfield was released. PJ Walker wasn't the starter anymore. Darnold almost took this team to the playoffs last year, the Panthers. So I think that's a sneaky solid signing for the Niners because if he has to play, it wouldn't shock me if we saw a kind of career resurrection from Sam Darnold under Kyle Shanahan. So I like that move, but outside of that, you lost too many starters to make up for the big Javon Hargrave signing. So they get a D free agency. For me, have a few teams left here to go over. The Seattle Seahawks are next. The Seattle Seahawks will get a B for me. Um, they improved a little bit, but it was mainly just they made some exchanges. They they exchanged Shelby Harris and Quentin Jefferson on the defensive line for Draymond Jones, Duron Reed, who was on the team a few years ago. Looks like with these moves they're not going to re-sign Puna Ford, but that's not the biggest deal in my opinion because you added some players there to replace the players you lost. Think they upgraded at offensive guard, going from Gabe Jackson to Evan Brown. Um, they did lose Austin Blythe to retirement, but he wasn't a very good center anyway, so I'm not going to count that too much against him. However, they still need to go address that position and get a center because the other center, Kyle Fuller, is a free agent. And I believe they didn't re-sign him yet, so let me double check on that. Um, just check the Seahawks depth chart to see who's the center. They didn't re-sign Kyle Fuller. I expect them to draft a center then, because currently they have a guy named Joey Hunt listed at the center, who I don't know much about. But yeah, what gets them a B grade for me though is Devin Bush going from Cody Barton to Devin Bush. Maybe a slight upgrade at linebacker, but then again, Devin Bush hasn't kind of worked out in his NFL career on the Steelers. But the big move was Jordan Love. Get another versatile secondary. You get another versatile secondary player back there, can play corner, safety. That's a very good signing, and it wasn't a bad contract deal anyway. So that's gonna get them a B grade for me. That move alone, and the upgrades at some other positions like guard and potentially interior defensive line. Although that's kind of a to be determined one. Um, but I can move on to the next team. This one will be short. The Rams. Whew. The Rams have had the worst offseason in the NFL and one of the worst off seasons I've seen in NFL history. The Rams get an F for this offseason. Traded Jalen Ramsey for a third round pick and a practice squad, maybe a third string tight end, and Hunter Long, who has one career catch, if I'm remembering correctly. That is a huge downgrade. Just a huge bad trade. You get a third round pick and a roster bubble player tight end for one of the best corners in football, probably a top 3 corner, has had seasons where he's been the best corner in football, and you trade him for a third round pick and Hunter Long. I don't understand it, but anyway, other than that, they released Bobby Wagner, who was arguably the best linebacker in football last year after they just signed him last offseason. They released Leonard Floyd, who has been a pretty productive edge rusher for them for years now. He's been the edge one the last 2-3 years. You didn't resign a starting safety in Nick Scott. Not the biggest move there. I'm mainly concerned about them not resigning or not bringing back Taylor Rapp, which that's not official yet, but it looks like he may be going elsewhere. You still have Jordan Fuller back there, but outside of that, you have Aaron Donald, Ernest Jones, Jordan Fuller, then a bunch of guys on this defense who have barely played NFL football. You also lost Greg Gaines to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So overall, Rams have had a bad offseason. They get an F for me. I can move on to my last team to talk about. The last team I'm going to talk about and the 32nd team I'm going over is the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals, they were another team that was on the borderline for F offseason. They get a D for me, though. I'm not factoring in the J.J. Watt, A.J. Green retirements because that's retirements. They can't control that. What I'm factoring in is releasing Marcus Golden, your best edge rusher. Now you're weak at that position with 2 young players in Majay Sanders and Cameron Thomas. They lost Zach Allen free agency. Pretty productive breakout year in the interior defensive line for them. They lost their best corner in Byron Murphy. And all that they added was Khalil White, who's a starting Cowboy linebacker, pretty solid. Nothing special though. Um, The reason why they don't get an F, they get a D, is because they did bring back two guys on the offensive line, guard Will Hernandez, right tackle Kelvin Beachum. They've yet to bring back the best guard in Justin Pugh, but we'll see if they bring him back. But yeah, the Cardinals have had a bad offseason. The Cardinals going to get a D for me, and that is going to wrap up the free agency grades for 2022 for me, or for 2023, excuse me. That is my free agency 2023 offseason grades. Just do 1 week of free agency and trades. Um, but yeah, so the Cardinals have had a bad offseason, gave them a D. I gave the Cardinals a D for the offseason, but that is going to wrap up this video, this podcast. Again, it is coming close to draft season. I'm kind of switching over from free agency to draft now. I will still cover free agency if those big moves that happen, I'll cover them. Only if those big moves, though. But I'm going to have my draft quarterback rankings out pretty soon. That should be in video format. So be on the lookout for that video. Excited for that one. Kind of my most excited video to make, to be honest, because I just love draft season. I'm finishing up watching the tape on these quarterbacks. I'm expecting to do other rankings for the draft too, cover the draft up until it happens, and maybe even after. We'll see. But anyway, that's going to do it for this podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed, and again, be on the lookout for the draft QB rankings. That'll come out soon. But until then, see ya. Peace.